Dan, thanks so much for doing the interview with us. Can you tell us who you are? What your background is?
Yeah. So my name is Dan Garfield, and I'm the Chief Open Source Officer at Codefresh, which is abbreviated to COSO or SOSO.
Okay. All right.
I'm a co-founder at Codefresh.
Uh-huh.
Raziel, the CEO, is really the brains behind the operation. And then I'm also an Argo maintainer, though I'm the least of Argo maintainers. And I helped create Open GitOps and the GitOps working group and create that standard for GitOps. I do a lot of work with CI/CD. I do a lot of work with software delivery, enabling companies and helping people improve their software processes and be more secure and deploy more frequently and all that kind of good stuff.
Right. So what kind of got you into the open source space to begin with?
Oh gosh, I started actually working on Helm.
Oh, really?
But not that much with code. I mean, I did my first open source commit years ago. I was very proud of it because it was basically my first open source contribution was for Quake.
Okay.
Because somebody
nice.
was making an HTML5 version of Quake,
Uh-huh.
and literally all I did was fix the launcher so that it worked properly.
Right.
It was a
right.
very small thing, but I
Well,
loved
usable
that.
though, right?
Yeah. So I loved doing that. That was cool to be oh, I contributed to that thing. That was really neat. And I don't do as much code work these days, but every once in a while here and there I'll make a few commits. But I started working on Helm, just trying to. We thought there was definitely a strategic interest in Helm with Codefresh because we help people deploy to Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
Helm is definitely becoming the de facto package manager.
Right.
And so the shift from Helm 2 to Helm 3 and spent a lot of time just chopping wood and carrying a little bit of water.
Uh-huh.
Don't ask Karina. She'll be like,
Yeah.
Dan, you didn't do anything. She's not wrong. So yeah, I started doing that, but then with Argo, this was a project that came out of company Applatix,
Okay.
and they didn't have a commercial path for it, so they were acquired by Intuit, and once they joined Intuit donated the project to the CNCF,
Mm-hmm.
and we started contributing pretty much right away. We
Okay.
joined the project, and then we launched the very first commercial version of Argo 4 months later.
Oh, wow.
So we've been doing commercial Argo, and we've been helping companies adopt Argo for 3 years now. So we have more experience in it than any other company.
Yeah.
We've done it in more diverse locations, more edge deployments.
I like diverse. That's that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Versus crazy or insane or difficult or.
Yes.
So let's back up a little bit. What is Argo?
So Argo is, as a project, has 4 tools. The one that people are most familiar with probably is Argo CD,
Mm-hmm.
which is a GitOps tool. So you basically define, this is where I want my software to be deployed, this is the source of truth for that software, and this is the policy for how you're going to keep that in sync.
Mm-hmm.
And that shift to GitOps, that's a pretty revolutionary thing. And I don't mean that because, I think you probably know people were doing stuff like that with Puppet, 15 years ago.
I actually wrote a what do they call them? Plugin, but it's not plugin for Nginx. That did some of that. Fighting with a big truck trying to get over. Because I didn't want to install Puppet. I can't think of words today. I didn't want to install the Puppet client on all of these machines because I was really afraid of them. So I wrote it. Nginx was already there, so I wrote a little plugin for Nginx.
Went through that, yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of people have. I think it gets a lot of buzzwords these days of the configuration as code and all that jazz. But at the same time, it's people don't realize the power of it if you're kind of doing it properly.
Yes. Well, I don't think that until we had the Kubernetes API, mm-hmm. it's been a lot harder to achieve. And now that we have this standardized API for delivering cloud native software, whatever that means,
yeah,
we have these GitOps operators that can suddenly operate in a very high level of efficiency where you have very little drift and things like that. I mean, we use Terraform, right? Everybody uses Terraform, but Terraform state gets corrupted all the time.
Right.
And so that makes it a lot more difficult to use in a proactive GitOpsy way. Whereas if you're using Kubernetes, Argo CD is going to be perfect. It's just going to work.
Yeah. So what do you feel like the kind of learning curve is on kind of doing the GitOps model? Not so much the technology involved, but like kind of the mindset. Do you think is it a difficult thing to come across, or do you find most people get it pretty fast?
It does there are some people who look at it and they say, well, I run a CI/CD pipeline, and I'm a big fan of CI/CD. Codefresh is a CI/CD company. But they'll say, well, I run a CI/CD pipeline. At the end of that, I have a step that executes a deployment. So how is this better? And I get that, because if you don't start doing it, you might not realize how much easier it is.
Right.
And you might not realize like how much time you spend babysitting deployments, or like if you ever have a deployment go wrong during a CI/CD process and you haven't written some sort of imperative case for it. If you're really good at writing imperative operations, you can make it feel almost declarative, but as soon as you go outside the bounds of what you can imperatively script, suddenly you run into problems. And so something that's like, we moved to declarative for a reason.
Right.
We moved to declarative because it's way easier to operate, and you know what you're going to get at the end, and you can have operators and policy that gets you there, but you can just worry about being declarative. So moving from imperative to declarative on a CI/CD perspective, I think that's something that people have a hard time wrapping their heads around.
Right.
The other thing that we see a lot of is just bad Git management.
Yeah.
And that's not shocking.
Right.
But when you're doing app development, you're using branches for all of your development and Git flow, and that's great, and it makes a lot of sense. When you start to do environments, doing Git flow and having branches, like a different branch for different environments, that's actually really awful. Like, it doesn't work very well, and it creates a lot of problems, because you're like, oh, well, I'm gonna promote a change from staging to production, and what does that entail? Oh, I need to cherry pick 37 commits perfectly.
Right.
Okay, good luck.
Yeah.
You're probably gonna have merge conflicts. It's probably gonna be a pain. And if you bring one of the values along with you that you didn't mean to, suddenly you're gonna be in trouble. Whereas what we recommend is using an environment per folder.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And now running diffs on that, super easy. You just diff 2 folders, you've got it all figured out.
Right.
Promoting changes and segregating things that are long-running values for staging or long-running values for production, that's a lot easier. So things like that, those are pretty common.
One of the things that I was kind of, it's like you learn things sometimes and you're like surprised that that's the really interesting thing you learned. So one of those for me, when I joined Red Hat, it's after I was there for a couple of years, is how much better at source control I became. Because, like Red Hat, is really, really good at that, right? It's really good at, kind of this very machine approach to releasing, because, like Red Hat's been doing essentially continuous delivery for 20 something years, right? It's just, we call it package managers, right? And it's really, it was really interesting how much I learned about how like software is really created, and like the best practices around it, and the pain when you don't do it right.
Well, that's a good use case to get your engineers, not yours, but yours writ large, to contribute to open source.
Yep.
Because Git management in open source tends to be actually very good.
Right.
Because it has to be. You have 5,000 contributors to this thing, so you need to have really good Git hygiene. And so I've working on Argo, and I've been doing some security work recently. I'm on we created a special interest group focused on security for Argo, and so I've been helping doing like cherry picks and things like that. But there's a lot of things that I've learned by doing this with open source that I didn't learn just contributing code into a company organization where maybe most companies don't have code owners files.
Right.
That's an open source thing.
Right. Well, and I think the other part too, which people don't really realize, right, is that when you're publishing code internally, you don't have the fear factor of, oh my God, everyone can see the terrible thing I did in this piece of software, or at least not as much. So I think one of the really cool things, one of the really freeing things in a sense about open source is not only do you get a sense of, hey, I'm going to put this in public, so I better do a good job. But also you get the feedback that you did do a good job, which I find
sometimes
really interesting. Well, yeah, sometimes, yeah.
You're more likely to get a complaint about what you've done. Yeah.
But at least when it actually gets accepted and consumed, you're like, well, no matter what they said, right? They shipped it, so it must have been pretty good.
Well, and you can see. One of the common things in our industry is imposter syndrome, right? Mm-hmm. Because technology is so vast that you're always going to run into something that you've probably never heard of, and the person you'll be talking to knows all about it,
right?
And you'll be like, oh, I thought I was like a senior engineer, or I thought I was a junior engineer, and I don't even know what he's talking about.
Right.
And with open source, you can sometimes have that alleviated a little bit because you'll be looking through something and you're like, oh, they forgot to squash their commits.
Oh, yeah.
And I can see that they were just like pushing like all these little nonsense changes, and you're like, oh, even senior engineers need to send a few extra commits sometimes. That's not so bad.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk about a lot actually is like one of the best things I learned in college was really actually how to learn and how to learn quickly. I think I spent a bunch of years in consulting, which also taught me a lot of that. But because the industry is just changing all the time. I think I've gotten to the point where I just assume I never know anything. And that way, I'm like good to go.
I had a conversation with a friend years ago, and actually he was focused on Kubernetes because he's a senior engineer. He was one of the most brilliant engineers I've ever known. Mm-hmm. He's learned a lot from this guy, and anytime I talked to him, I always thought, oh man, I have a lot to learn. And one day I was talking to him about some stuff with Kubernetes and containers, and he had no idea what I was talking about.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, whoa, did that just happen? Right, like I actually know something that you didn't already write like a doctrinal thesis on this thing?
Yeah, that's funny. Containerization, I think in particular, I find that a lot, where it's like somebody who I know knows technology really, really well, and then is like has never been anywhere near a container.
Yeah.
Which I find interesting, because like I got into them because they made my life easier, because I didn't have to like spin up a VM every 5 minutes to work on a project. So yeah, huge fan. We call this the Insider Show because we want to know what you think is coming. So what are you kind of most looking forward to coming through Argo or even CD? Or kind of those concepts. What do you think is the thing to watch or the thing to be hoping for in the next 6 months, a year?
Let me think about what, because there's stuff that I'm like betting our company on.
Oh yeah,
that I don't necessarily want to like go as deep into those things as much. But like, there's definitely more democratization of these tools and technology. And I think going back to your Puppet example, orchestrating GitOps 15 years ago. Was kind of a dark art.
Right.
It was like you had arcane knowledge, you had these super specialized people that, like, if they ever disappeared, your company's just going to collapse. And that's, it's nice for the people who are getting the paycheck. But now with tools like Argo, it's becoming so much easier.
Right.
And so it's becoming more accessible. And so we're just seeing this huge explosion of people doing it. And so, 3 years ago, when we started telling people, hey, you should be using Argo, you should be doing GitOps, here's how you should be setting up your repositories, the value wasn't necessarily immediately clear to everybody, but now you can definitely feel that push. So I think a democratization of that is happening. That's really exciting. Obviously, machine learning and AI is a very hot topic, and there are a lot of ways we could apply that within software delivery.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily always comfortable, because if you have something like, oh, I want to have an AI watching all of my logs and all my metrics and looking for anomalies and have it automatically trigger rollbacks, most people don't deliver their software without a human clicking deploy.
Right.
So how comfortable are they going to be with an AI doing a rollback in an automated way?
Yeah.
But I think we'll get there. I mean, it's like driving a car. Like 10 years ago, the idea of an AI driving a car was, oh, I could never trust it. Mm-hmm. And now we still don't trust it, but we could see a future where we might trust it.
Right. Well, it's the other part that I think is really interesting around the kind of AI ML problem for those scenarios too is the the changing baseline, where like I still remember talking to a friend of mine who like was running a company that did log analysis basically, and what was really interesting was that their big thing that they were trying to figure out was like, how do we recognize when the baseline changes so we can stop alerting you, because now this is just a normal day. And I think that's where, things like machine learning really start to come into play and get interesting. But I don't know that the problem with machine learning is that you need a lot of data to, get good models. And I don't know that we have that in any sort of unified way, because one thing we're not seeing a lot of in kind of the open source world, at least yet, is the sharing of how your GitOps whatever environment works, so that we can kind of be learning more from each other. That tends to be I don't think it's intentionally secretive, but it tends to be secret, and so I think that'll be a really interesting kind of breakthrough when people start getting a lot more, I hesitate to say open as much as like it becomes more of its own community.
Yeah, I wouldn't hold my breath for people to start sharing their data too quickly.
Well, right, yeah. So that's the other challenge, right?
But and then there's definitely a lot of like nuance in how you train those algorithms, because you could see scenarios where, oh, this is learning, and it's learning how to detect anomalies, but anomalies are building up slow enough over a long period of time that it assumes that anomaly buildup is normal, and so you could see a situation where it's sort of like you're slowly boiling the frog,
right,
and you didn't get to the point,
or you get a rollback because you're not getting enough errors.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, oh, I expected more errors. Right. Better roll back.
Right.
This is the devil I know.
Right,
not ready for this new world of no errors.
Right. Yeah. Although to be honest, right, as a human who has some level of at least intelligence, I have looked at systems and been concerned about it because I'm not getting the errors I'm expecting.
Yeah.
And been right occasionally, right? Where the reason you're not getting any errors is because it's completely broken.
Well, that's the old joke. What scares you more as a software engineer? When you make a change and it works the first time without errors, right. Or you get errors that you know.
Right. Yeah, I think if I get no errors, that definitely makes me think I missed something.
Oh no.
Yeah. I totally hear that. So I was going to ask you kind of a little bit of a sidebar. I was doing a little bit of background on you and saw you did a backpacking trip around Europe.
Yes, years ago. Yeah. Yes, long time ago. And I was in Holland. I had some friends in Utrecht.
Oh, cool.
Utrecht.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's how you say it.
That was pretty close, I think.
It sounded like I knew what I was talking about.
Right.
But yeah, we stayed in Utrecht. We went into Germany. Went into Switzerland. I slept on the street in Switzerland.
Oh, that's always not comfortable.
I was a poor college student, I went to Sicily. I slept on the beach in Sicily.
Nice.
So that was a lot of fun. Got in a motorcycle accident.
Oh, that's less
fun.
And
that was, an adventure.
Right.
Yeah, great adventure.
Would you do it again?
Oh, well, I would go back in time and do it again.
Yeah.
But, I've got 4 kids now.
Yeah, right.
And I would go backpacking with my kids.
Yeah,
I'd do that.
All right. Well, because it was funny, like I think I was talking to you earlier, I drove from Prague to Krakow for a conference, and I am really glad I did it, and I will never do it again.
Oh, really?
Maybe if I don't know if I can handle one of my kids driving. My kids are inner city kids.
Oh boy,
Not big on the driving. It was great once, so I'll have to find another opportunity that was similar. There's a guy I used to work with actually who everywhere he went, he would drive. And I always thought it was kind of crazy. Oh, I think that was the left I wanted.
Well,
Oh,
we'll
well.
get there. We'll get there. Eventual
Eventually.
consistency.
Exactly,
Eventual
exactly.
consistency is all we care about
Right.
in the software delivery world. GitOps world.
So it was kind of a lot of fun. So I was kind of curious about the backpacking experience the same way, but it sounded like you'd repeat it,
Yeah, I mean, when I did it, I was doing it and I didn't have a job. So I had worked, and then the company I was at, and I was like working my way through college, and the company I was at downsized, and I was like a college student, and so I didn't have a job, and so I had already booked my ticket to Europe, so I came out here with like almost no money,
Yep.
and spent a while, and I would buy like a baguette and some cheese for €2, and that was like the day.
Right.
And
right.
I had a train pass, so I was just moving around and stuff, and it would definitely be different now because I can afford to buy food, so that would be a
That's
pretty
definitely
exciting
a step up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, it's cool. I'm kind of jealous that you had the opportunity to do it in the first place.
Oh yeah, of course.
I did manage to get to Prague while I was in college, but mostly just like a trip. And we went down to Rome and stuff, but it was much more of a vacation than it was kind of a long tour,
Yeah, and I mean, now that you put it as like, would you do it again? We got robbed 5 times. We got accosted by a soccer team that had just won a championship and was high on cocaine.
All right.
We got, in a motorcycle accident. Like, it was high adventure. And adventure comes with a lot of stories, and it's great to look back on. Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily do those parts of the adventure again.
Right. I hear you. Yeah, that was kind of how I felt about the drive to Poland. Was that it wasn't didn't have any of those kinds of problems, but it was like the adventures were great. Things like not being able to figure out. We wanted to go to a restaurant for lunch, and we couldn't figure out anywhere to park. Like, had no idea because we were in this tiny little village, and we had no idea like how you went about parking. And of course didn't speak the language in the Czech Republic or Poland, and so it was a lot of stupid little stuff like that, which is really kind of cool to experience, but not something
you don't want to do it every day,
right? Yeah. And it never would even occur to you that these are the problems you're going to have.
Yeah, the misadventures need to be infrequent enough for their novelty to outweigh their displeasure.
Yeah, exactly. I totally hear you. So you think CD is the thing, is what you're going to change the world with?
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing. Yeah,
that's awesome.
It actually, I mean, we're pretty lucky working in software because we work with companies all the time that are changing the world. And I know it's cliche, and I don't talk about it much because it feels a little cliche, but like if I help a team at a healthcare company deliver software faster, it's like literally saving lives.
Right.
And I'm not smart enough to save lives directly.
Right.
So if I can save lives indirectly, that feels pretty good. Like, I'm happy I can contribute to that cause. Software is amazing in that way. Like, you can touch so many things.
Well, it's particularly interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things so in some of the classes we teach that like I teach and I help oversee and stuff, we do these projects for third-party organizations like nonprofits and local government mostly. And what's so interesting about it is trying to get the students to recognize that every row of this table is a human a lot of the time, and that's so important. And we try very hard to make sure that they recognize that it's not just data, right? It's real people or real something, and I think it really starts to appeal to the students that way, where it's like, hey, I can make a difference without being a doctor, right?
We talk a lot about empathy within DevOps, within software, and I've started actually, I'll phrase it poorly. I've started to move away from that. No more empathy.
Okay,
no.
all right, yeah.
No,
yeah,
I've started to
poorly
move.
Phrased.
No, I've started to move towards charity, and the way that I think of that is empathy plus wisdom. Because somebody delivering software poorly, or someone having a bad experience, you can empathize with them, but not necessarily have the wisdom to help in any way.
Right.
To know what to do. And so you could say, oh, you're doing this. This is really hard on you. You know what? You should quit software.
Right.
That's very empathetic of me.
Right.
But if maybe charity is saying, oh, this is really hard. Here's how you could fix it. So I started to say, you know what? I think you need an extra part of the equation. So not moving away from empathy, but empathy plus wisdom, charity.
Interesting. Yeah, because I mean, that's, sometimes with empathy, it's like you can be maybe potentially more proactive than empathetic, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of what you're getting at.
Because I can feel bad for someone, but then not actually be helpful.
Right. Whereas if you can do both, it's even better.
Yeah, then it's amazing.
Well, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it, and I hope you had an enjoyable drive.
Thanks for the drive. Do I tip or?
Yeah, exactly. You can tip your waiter. But.